Okay, we're in the second week in a new class. The large topic for the next few months till through the end of December is the coming great global spiritual awakening. And yeah, we'll see who can say that easily earliest. It might be a while. We started last week. I know most of the people here last week did not return. Hey, I think they will. I know Art and Julie and some others are out of town. Charles is out of town. Well, Charles is finishing up. I wish I had his email. He just passed his it's like a script write that's the equivalent of his thesis for his master's in theater. And so that was a big deal this week. And that's Charles Ricks. But I think he has an event as part of that program this afternoon that made it difficult for him to get out from the city this morning. Anyway, the coming great global spiritual awakening. I'm doing a little review for a couple of reasons. One is to get the other four people who ought to be here when we get to the new stuff. But the last week we noted that that every 500 years, at least you can sort of do the numbers on this. Every 500 years in church history, there is a major turning point. Now, if you allow me 50 or 60 years, okay. And it's not new, and probably people were looking for it, something wonderful about the number 500, but Phyllis Tickle and then later Diana Butler Bass picked up on this, and as a medieval historian, it made sense to me. But anyway, we talk about somewhere around the year 500, certainly in the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great and Benedict of Nursia with the monastic movements. It's the beginning of organized monasteries. And that's going to be a regular part of Christianity for another 1,500 years. Around 1000 AD, the Bishop of Rome, now armed with greater literacy, armed with the rediscovery of canon law and various other things, the Bishop of Rome can now, and also with the inspiration of the beginning nation states like France and England, decides the Bishop of Rome should jump into the monarchical race, and the church in Rome becomes a papal monarchy. It's called the Gregorian Reform, and it's part of the 11th century. And the church is never the same after then. Much of the papacy we recognize now really got its form 1,000 years ago. Then the 1500 one is a little more obvious. Most people have a sense of the Protestant Reformation and breakdown of the universal nature of the church at that time, and so on. And we'll keep coming back to that one. Well, it's my observation, and partly because my background's not only in theology, but also sociology and history, but and interfaith studies, with working with the Interfaith Council here for a number of years, running a book club for them, an interfaith book club. It's my understanding, especially on interfaith studies, we've come to that kind of situation again. And I talked about it last week, and this is a good principle, not only for understanding church history, but also for understanding your life, which is things come together and fall apart. They come together and they fall apart again, but often it's in their falling apart that space is made for what is new and better. Yeah, if you've lived long enough, that's true of your life. It's also true of organizations. It's true of nations. It's true of, you know, the rhythms of world history. So we talked about we've talked about already the great decline in church attendance that began before COVID. It was accentuated with COVID, and we saw that, or most people see that. The religious journalism seems to see it as really bad news, and I don't see it as bad news. I think it's a warning shot across Christianity to get its act in order. And I think Christianity will. I think it's I think there'll be an appropriate response to that, but you can't get away with some of the ideas that you could get away with when all your neighbors essentially thought the same way you did. Yeah, we went to 1,000 different denominations, so we didn't see anything wrong with that. But all said, we all had a basically common worldview. But now, you know, when your son or your daughter go to university and their roommate is Hindu and they end up marrying someone Jewish, you're going to have to rethink your ideas about a lot of things. And that's what's happening. And it's natural, it's good, and that's what we're talking about today. So what we're talking about, started last week, talking about now, is how the church has been weighed in the scales and found wanting, taking off from a story in Daniel chapter 5 of the Babylonian king Belshazzar sees his handwriting on the wall, can't find it. He knows it's bad news because, you look over there and the room's kind of dark and suddenly there's a hand, writing across the wall, and you're going, I doubt that's good news, and he's right. He can't find any of his astrologers to interpret it. He finds Daniel, and what some of it says is, you have been weighed in the scales and found wanting, and that is that's where this particular title comes from, and the notion that the church is being weighed in the scales now and is being found wanting, particularly by millennials and the people who come after them. And so what we know, and I'm at the bottom of page 1, that most people these days seek compassion. Many folks these days, I'd like to think it's most, sometimes I wonder, but I do know many folks these days seek compassion, decency, common sense, and inclusiveness. But in their experiences, they have not found these things in churches, mosques, and synagogues. They seek to make sense of a God they still believe in, but whom they struggle to find in organized religion. And they should not, and they will not go to churches. They will not go to churches they find to be less moral than they themselves are. That is the problem today. And then the question we looked at last week, and it was an interesting discussion, is should they? Should they go to churches that are less moral than they are? And actually, that's a pretty complicated question and has pretty complicated answers, because behind that drive for a lot of people, which is a notion of perfectionism that isn't human. I mean, if you're just looking for the churches who have their act completely in order, you will never go to church. But on the other hand, there are churches that it's not that they don't have their act in order. They're pulling for the exact opposite of what Jesus was pulling for, and that's, in some cases, and certainly they come across that way. And so for a lot of people, their problem is, why would I go? I already think in more moral ways than Pastor so-and-so down the street. Okay, so and so on this is pretty new stuff. When you think of the word fundamentalist, what do you think of?
Bible. Think of people who are aligned with a literal meaning of the Bible.
Well, as long as you throw literal in. Yeah. A lot of people who think they're aligned with the Bible. So I mean, it used to be you could almost think fundamentalist, evangelical, Bible believing, and that kind of made a sense. Eva.
I don't know why I associated the word fundamental with radical.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's just what pops to mind when,
Yeah.
in my.
9/11 changed the definition of fundamentalist. And the small silver lining in 9/11 was it forced eventually, after a lot of mayhem in the Middle East, it forced Christians to reconsider their literalistic readings of scripture, because that's what had led to 9/11, literalistic readings of the Quran. And that led to 3,000 people dying in New York City and elsewhere. Robert?
Yeah, I should think your fundamentalists have strong views on abortion.
Yeah, you identify them. You actually end up with American Christian fundamentalists. I'm going to be kind of hard on them right now and say, you don't end up with the notion of Jesus. Hardly comes up except as a slogan. You end up with a strong notion of abortion, being of pro-life and anti-gay. Yeah, David.
I think fire and brimstone.
Oh, what?
Fire and brimstone.
Yeah, fire and brimstone. Yeah, Laconia.
I think of certainty without meaning.
Yeah. Eric.
Well, maybe I'm taking a broader view, but you can focus only on the fundamentals on either side of any argument. So there are fundamentalists. I'm going.
Hold the press.
I'll wait until you move
Skip
on.
ahead.
I'll wait until you move on.
You have anticipated where we're going.
Okay.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Exactly. I mean, the point is, the point I'm going to get at right now is that there are secular fundamentalists. So it's true that some of the people who are giving up on church are completely secularized. They're living only for themselves and only for their own lifestyles. I mean, secularism is essentially trying to interpret reality and interpret the world we live in without reference to God. That's essentially, and within certain circles, it's probably the appropriate approach. But when it becomes all of society, you have a problem. So some people are hostile to religion. Of course, they don't go to church. Some are what we would call secular fundamentalists. That is, they are as dogmatic as arrogant and as black and white in their thinking as religious fundamentalists. Okay, and the prime example is a book by Sam Harris called The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason. And okay, and so I read that book back then. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, he makes some good points. You can learn some things from Sam Harris, but he mistitled his book. The End of Faith. He wasn't talking about the end of faith. He was talking about the end of texts, religious texts not being understood in their historical context. That wouldn't have been a very catchy title, but that is what his book was about. He was giving you example after example of when you take anyone's sacred text, our Bible, someone's Quran, various other religious texts. When you take those and you fail to understand them in their historical context, you come up with nonsense. Often, over and over and over again. That's that literalistic reading. And in the end, Sam Harris's argument with religion was not faith. Faith is not really the problem. It's how you interpret the sacred books of faith, and whether you do it in black and white thinking or whether you let the texts actually tell you themselves how they should be taken. And it won't be in black and white thinking, not if the Bible, I mean, you might have noticed a few multiple perspectives in scripture. And I mean, that's because they're there. And so you might expect the people who follow scripture might have some multiple perspectives. Because it's rooted into our documents themselves. Okay, so, but many others don't attend church because the teachings of the church just don't make sense to them. It's not that they don't care about being good or kind. It's not that they don't believe in God. Most of them do believe in God. But they find the implications of some dark doctrines of traditional Christianity too horrifying, for that matter, too immoral to contemplate. And if this trend has picked up speed in just the last 20 years or so, in fact, it began a long time ago. Okay, so let's think about that a bit. Thinking of church teachings that no longer make sense to a lot of people. Eva.
I was brought up in Catholic Church. From the time I was a small child, the Catholic Church, I was taught that God is a punishing God. You blink and you sin. And from that day, when I realized that, there is no point trying. I'm going to hell regardless, because I always, my thoughts, I broke a toy and I sin and I'm going to hell. That kind of, believing is so damaging that I think I was a teenager that I said, I'm not going to church anymore.
Yeah.
Why bother?
Yeah.
So that's one of the.
That might even be number one. There are a few others. Teachings of the church that no longer make sense to many people.
I'm gonna kind of tee off of Eva. Because we have a similar background. I mean, all the way up until like I was 17 years old, we went to church every Sunday, 7:30 mass.
Yeah.
And you didn't eat before church.
Yes, you couldn't.
This was, that's another thing, you couldn't eat an hour before communion. I don't know why they picked an hour. Maybe it was the swimming thing. You can't eat an hour before you get the flesh of God because something will go horribly wrong. And there's another teaching. And maybe that's what's irritating me about what we're doing up in the chapel. But the fact that the priest could stand up there and hold this little wafer. I mean, I bought candy that had that same kind of wafer in it. He held up that wafer, he said a few magic words, and this turned into the flesh of Christ. And I'm like, that's kind of makes us all cannibals, doesn't it? We're actually eating his body and drinking his blood, and that's kind of weird. But my grandmother died, and my father stopped going to church. The whole family, the whole bunch of it just kind of went bye. Because he was doing it for her. So he wasn't even going to church for him.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Anna. You're correcting Aaron, I assume.
Well, I have a different viewpoint because I did not grow up in the Catholic Church. I grew up in the Church of Christ. And I don't honestly remember if it was ever spelled out specifically. But I always had the impression we were the in group. And if you didn't agree with everything that was said here, you were going straight to hell.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had heard the fire and brimstone from the pulpit. Luckily, I was young enough that it just kind of went.
It's silly. Morgan Prophet Davis, you've spoken here once before, so we don't quite know how to treat you as a guest. You're sort of part of, anyway, your comment.
Yeah, I was thinking about in particular in light of all the events that have been happening in our international sphere, particularly in Gaza. The book of Joshua is a really hard story to read and a really hard theological claim to make that God is seemingly okay with the Israelites going and killing multiple times every man, woman, and child.
Sounds like genocide.
it sounds a lot like genocide. And there are a lot of people who, as they have grown up in these literal communities, when they read that, they really struggle to reconcile, how can a good God also be okay with this? And I think that it has forced a lot of people to either abandon that literalist understanding and maybe say, you know, like I can't be a part of something that is seemingly supportive of this in some sort of way. Or it's forced people to recognize that, you know, if you look at archaeological evidence, oh, these things maybe didn't actually literally happen. But that still begs the question of, well, why were they written that way?
Yeah.
And like, what does that mean about the communities who were producing these texts? And what is it that they were trying to make sense of? And why did they feel the need to use this really violent,
Yeah.
really aggressive energy and language to depict? It's that, to me, that's one of those things of, that's quite a dark
Oh.
theological claim to have made and that people still make in very, very horrible ways today.
Well, yeah, and the texts understood instantly. I'm passing this around now. It's heading toward John, so we'll start over here. Let's see, anyone have a pen? Okay, I mean, that's an interesting case in point. I mean, why were they written that way? I mean, I could simplify that real quickly. They were written that way because that's the way you wrote stuff like that back then. Whoever you were Greek, you know, whatever. But the fact that it was taken as flat-footed, exactly the way it was and exactly the way God intended it to be, it would be behind the Afrikaner, be behind the imperialism, the colonialism in Africa. It would be behind behind white races, European races, decimating First Nation people in America. I mean, these texts were not just, you know, weren't without consequence. They were with horrible consequence. But, you know, but again, and I'm simplifying why they were written that way, but what I'm saying is historical context, knowing the history of the time, how literature was written then and what it meant when it said certain things, as opposed to just a flat-footed reading of scripture. Other teachings Laconia.
The primacy of male leadership.
Yeah. Primacy of male leadership. Charles last week, looking ahead and knowing he wasn't going to be here this week, threw in traditional notions of the atonement. And certainly any notion of why did Jesus die? Why the cross? There's many different notions, but the one that came to dominate fundamentalism was the substitutionary notion of atonement. But I'd say, and that's one form of kind of a family of schools. And that family of schools said that the reason Christ died was to appease the wrath of an angry God. One way or the other, it's basically what we've said already. What we started with and what we've kept coming back to, that so much of that has been at the heart of many Christian doctrines. I mean, what Eva started with, she didn't use the word, but traditional notions of hell are about as dark as you can get. And the reason people don't realize that is because they don't apply their imagination to what the heck they're saying. This baking, boiling, blistering for, of people who don't measure up to what God wanted, this loving God, this God you ought to trust. But man, if you get it wrong, you bake, broil, and blister, not for a minute or 5 minutes or an hour or a day or a week or a month or a year, but forever and ever and ever. Absurd. Now, the actual teachings of Jesus on Gehenna, I believe, have substance to them. There's a reason he said what he said, and the way he said it. But it's not the traditional understanding. That's not the conclusion you can draw from that. But anyway, this kind of thing has been going on for ages, and it's part of the reset that's happening now. People are saying, not me. I can't buy that. That does not make sense to me. Okay, so way back in the 18th century, Christian or Western culture turned against the historic church. Many educated people lost respect for Christianity. And that respect never came back. We call it secularization, and we assign it an inevitability. Many suppose that as more and more people became educated, they predictably turned against religion. But there's nothing predictable about this. It's not knowing more that undermines faith. What undermines faith is not more education, but bad behavior. And that is bad behavior on the part of the church. That's what undermines faith, when the people who claim to have faith are acting in ways that civilize people essentially look at and say, that doesn't make sense. It's not more education, it's bad behavior that creates secularization. The church turning secular was far from inevitable, It didn't have to be. And so consider today, well, for instance, I think of John 13, verses 34 and 35. The night before Jesus dies, John has this extended period of chapters 13 to 17, what Jesus is doing and saying at that Last Supper. And in a very short section of a long section, but picking two verses, he said, I want you to love one another as I have loved you, so you must love me. By this, all people will know you are my disciples, if you love one another. If you love one another. And so he basically gave the world the mark of Christianity. This is what I'm gonna, this is what I'm gonna let you judge my claimed disciples by. Do they love one another? If they don't act in loving ways, oh, okay. If they don't act in loving ways, I'm going to expect you're not going to buy it. You're not going to see that they're disciples of me unless they love one another. And that's what I'm saying. In the 18th century, it's pretty clear Christians didn't love one another. I mean, across the board. In every century, there were decent, good, caring Christians whose lives were affected by Jesus in marvelous, transformative ways. That has always been true. But across the life force of the 18th century, well, the 17th century, you just had all these religious wars that basically decimated the population of Europe between some princes carrying Protestant flags and some princes carrying Catholic flags. And by the time you get to Voltaire and Diderot and David Hume, they're looking back at that and saying, we cannot trust the future to the church. We did trust it to the church. And we ended up in a 30 years war that tore Europe to pieces, or wars of secession in France, or the revolt of the Dutch against the Spanish Empire, all essentially religious wars. Okay, so our notion then, and I read this often even in Facebook, is some really smart, educated person goes into a full-throated assault on atheists. Good idea? You can disagree with me. I mean,
No,
why?
it didn't put the focus on intellect and put the focus on act.
Okay.
Well, mainly because you're not, very rarely do you convince someone of your argument by out speaking. I mean, I've seen, you know, incredibly intellectual atheists go off on religious people, and I look at them and I laugh, and I'm like, you understand that everything you believe, everything you know, because science can prove everything, started with belief. Belief is faith.
Yeah.
If having faith makes you weak, that means your entire premise makes you weak. Everything that's a law, the law of gravity, the laws of physics, all started out as a belief in a concept that might be true. You prove the concept is true, it becomes a law, but it started out as a belief.
Hey, Dale, I hear Aaron, but I'm probably on the other side. I'm on the side of, I'm more aggrieved by religious people who argue with atheist people about something, number one, that can't be proved. But number two, the atheist may actually be living a greater moral life than the Christian that they're on.
I'm just calling it, to me, this is just a thought question. I mean, there are places for debating an atheist perspective. I'm just saying that full-throated, the problem today is atheists. No, the problem today is still religious folk living up to what they claim to, in some general sense. You won't find perfect religious people, but some notion of Jesus is our lodestar. That is what drives us. How would Jesus respond in this case? And it just, the story, we were talking about this on Wednesday night, and I think it was important. Essentially, the argument of the letter of Colossians is at the end of chapter 1, Paul starts talking about the mystery once hidden but now revealed. The mystery is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And then a few verses later, over in chapter 2, he's talking, I don't want you to be misled by anyone's fine sounding arguments, or by fine sounding arguments is what he says. And now the point he was making, and I really believe this is true to the Colossians, is what matters is this person, Jesus, this story. You take this person in, you take this story in, you relive this story. And the power is all in there. And I think if you went back and you looked at church history where the church actually had its shining moments, it would almost always be where that kind of thing was happening. I mean, I could cite Francis of Assisi, but there were thousands of Francis of Assisi's that didn't get quite his fame. But that notion of relive the story, that's where the power to transform society is. And so when Paul goes on into chapter 2, when he goes on into chapter 2, he's saying, I don't want anyone to take you captive with fine sounding arguments. Well, and what we've tended to do, and when I was back in the day learning to be a minister, it was basically, well, those people's fine sounding arguments, you know, because we've got the right ones, you know, but those people don't. And well, sometimes something like that's true, but I think what Paul is saying is, by no fine sounding arguments, it's Jesus. It's this life, it's this story, it's no complicated code of conduct, which he spends the rest of chapter 2 saying, don't let people judge you by this, or this. It has no benefit in restraining the sensual indulgences, which is what a whole lot of this is supposed to be about. So you know, so that's the key point here. Okay, so what happened in the 18th century, late 17th, was people like Voltaire and Hume and Diderot and others held up the church in the light of history and reason and scripture, held it up to the teachings of Jesus, and found it badly wanting. They were tired of church wrangling that had led to nearly a century of devastating religious warfare across Europe. Millions of people in the 16th and 17th century Europe had died because of religions called Christian. So now these thinkers were tired of people being killed. Catch this, and they write this. It's interesting to read the writings of Voltaire and the French writer Diderot and others like that. They were tired of people being killed for the sake of arguments no one could fully understand because they are sacred mysteries. You know, that so much of scripture is dealing with sacred mysteries, you know, too deep for our words. And so they were tired of people being killed for the sake of arguments no one can fully understand this. Why are we killing one another? You know, and they were right on that. They were tired of churchmen manipulating 3 or 4 passages that seemed to favor their viewpoint and forgetting 100 that destroyed it. And you know, so in fact, there's a question a little bit later, but we're playing the clock right now. I was going to ask examples of doctrines or teachings that seem to rest on 3 or 4 passages in scripture when multiple other passages seem to teach otherwise. And I was going to ask for examples of that. I'm inclined to say at this point is give me examples of any other kind of teaching. That almost any teaching that's dogmatically held to rests on about 4 proof texts. And even though the heavy weight of scripture is against those dogmatically held to, they're argued over. But over and over, you know, I would say, I'm going to use my words carefully here, but abortion as the murder of a human being. Now, if you want to talk about abortion as tragedy, I can follow you. It's tragic. It's sad. It's sad for everyone involved in it. Most people who are ever involved in it know that. Okay, but abortion as murder of a human being. Give me the text. You know, give me a text. Give me any text. Scripture has almost nothing to say about the subject. Only a bunch of inferences that are thrown together and piled together, and superstructure is created, none of which holds the weight of it, and it comes crashing down under the light of examination. So I'm not making an argument here for abortion. I'm saying the notion of abortion as murder of a human being, that's what's doubtful. I mean, in fact, since I really wish there were very few abortions in the world, I wish people would quit carrying the signs around that call it murder, because that's what kills the honest discussion that could bring common sense to it, you know. And so that's to me a clear example of that. The other thing I could say is there's lots of good ideas that 3 or 4 verses in scripture support. If you just take them as good ideas and not as dogmatic certitudes, you know. But when you take as dogmatic certitudes what you only have 2 or 3 verses on, 3 or 4 verses on, and there are hundreds of, a lot of the weight of scripture is actually against that viewpoint, then Voltaire and Diderot and others were saying, can't follow you. I mean, and it's the dogmatic certitude. It's not necessarily the fact that you think that, but just recognize that that's what you're doing. You're thinking that. When you go to the level of dogmatic certitude, you're in more trouble. Okay, I'm going to call the clock on it and give John appropriate time to